So, hello and welcome to all our viewers.
Hello.
Hello, sir. Today we have a very special guest with us. We have Dr. Stephen Whitehead, who is an internationally renowned sociologist, researcher, writer on gender, sexuality, education for over 2 decades now, and originator of the concepts of total inclusivity and totally inclusive self love. His books have generated enormous media interest and reached millions across the world. Welcome, sir, to today's session.
Thank you. Nice to be here talking to you.
Thank you. So, could you say something about your the whole concept of total inclusivity? How did it come?
Total,
Yeah.
okay, total inclusivity, right. That took root in me in about 2021 when I was doing doing professional development at a very elite all-girls school in the UK, a school that the royal family had actually attended many years ago. And this school wanted help and guidance on anti-racism. They were getting a lot of kickback from students and some staff about historic racism in the school. And the teachers weren't really aware of it. They didn't really understand it. And they called me in, plus another expert, to give them some professional development, which we did. And at the end of this program of PD, I realized that actually the racism bit was fine, that needed to be addressing. But there were other issues as well around class, sexuality, LGBT identities, homophobia. There was a lot. And that's when the concept of total inclusivity came up. And I started writing about it. I did some articles on it, which got published. And then I approached a publisher, an academic publisher, Routledge, with the proposal for 3 books on total inclusivity. One looking at total inclusivity in schools, another one looking at total inclusivity in universities, and a third general book that looked at total inclusivity in organizations or at work. And I got into writing those. I got some co-writers for 2 of the books. And the books all came out at the end of 2022. And certainly the book on the Total Inclusivity at Schools book, that has become a global web bestseller. That's done very well. A lot of schools around the world, particularly international schools, private schools, have picked up on that and they're using it for their own professional development now. So total inclusivity basically means what it says. You don't exclude anybody. Everybody, whatever their identity mix is, it's included, it's valued, it's authenticated, it's validated, it's protected. That's what any organization should be, but certainly an education organization.
Okay. So, you are the originator of the concept. So, what does that mean? As in, did you coin the term? I mean, did it come into the scholarly circles? What does it mean when you say
Well,
originator?
it means that I thought of it. I came up with the term.
Okay.
It was my concept, my term, and I defined it. So you'll see in the 3 books, you'll see the same definition of total inclusivity. Um, and it's inarguable. You can't argue against it. I mean, I think one of the things I say in the books is that the only people who are excluded from total inclusivity are those who don't believe in total exclusivity and want to exclude other people. And therefore, they, by definition, will exclude themselves from this concept. But any thinking, fair, rational, considerate human being is going to want to be included in their work, in their family, in their lives, in their community, and in their society. And quite rightly, why not? But that requires awareness. It requires training in some instances, certainly in organizations. And it requires empathy, emotional intelligence. And as far as organizations are concerned, it means you don't just focus on the bottom line, but you focus on the people who you're employing and the people who you're serving. Because if your organization is not totally inclusive, so therefore it's probably default racist, sexist, maybe even misogynistic, maybe even bullying, then it's not a healthy organization. Frankly, I would advise any young person to avoid working in any organization that's not TI.
Wow. feel so grateful to be talking to you.
It's my pleasure.
Okay. So, just to give a little context to our viewers, in your recent interview, you have extensively spoken about the ongoing cultural revolution across the world with
Mm,
regard to how solo living and
mm,
celibacy are reshaping
mm.
today's world society and redefining personal preferences. Drawing
Okay.
from recent statistics, apparently across the world, today the younger generations are defying traditional social norms and deciding to go solo living. In China, the singles population has reached a record 239 million in 2021, and more than half of the Chinese aged 25 to 29 are now living solo lives today. In US, about 46.4%, which is almost half of the US population, US adult population is single, and against a 22% in 1950. UK, South Korea, similar trends, and even countries with a strong, traditionally strong marriage culture like Thailand, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Nigeria, Pakistan, and India are now seeing a rise in singletons. What's going on?
Well, let me just make, before I tell you what's going on, or suggest what I think is going on, let me just say something about India, because India is interesting as well.
Hmm.
Um, the number of unmarried Indian men has risen 10% in the past 10 years. That's up from about 50% to over 60% now, and it's continuing to rise. At the same time, in India, we're seeing a decline in arranged marriages. Now, you know as well as I do that arranged marriages have been very popular, but they've gone down from 68% 5 years ago to around 40% today. So if it continues on that trajectory, by the end of this century, there will not be any arranged marriages in India, or very few. The other point to make about the demographics of India, which is supported and mirrored across the world, is that 45% of the Indian population is married, but only 8% of the 20 to 30 age group. So we're seeing 90% of Generation Z are deciding not to marry or delay marry, or they're against marriage altogether. Now we have to see if that demographic stays single into their 30s and 40s. But right now, there's only 8% of the 20 to 30-year group who are getting married. And I think all the indicators are that that's not going to change. It's going to continue. So what is happening? Basically, we've had since the 1950s a global gender revolution. Now, in the 1950s, sociologists like myself started to spot, not me, I was too young in the 1950s, but certainly those who were working in the 1950s noticed that post-war, there were big changes taking place in female identity and male identity. These were partly to do with globalization, the massification of further and higher education, changing work patterns, the end of the male breadwinner family, the rise of women, a new female independence. And my next book, which will be coming out in the new year, I talk about independent femininity, and that's a new type of femininity, or an emerging femininity that we're now starting to see. Now, that feminine identity is assertive, independent, agentic, self-actualizing. It's not going to slot itself into a patriarchal arrangement, which for many women, that's what marriage is.
Hmm.
It's not like that for most men. For most men, they get a good deal out of marriage, but not most women. They can end up in abusive relationships. They can end up having to do multiple jobs, not just looking after the family and any children, but also having to bring in money. So for many women, educated women with options, they're quite rightly saying, why do I bother to get married? I don't need to get married. So this change started in the 1950s. We're now into the full-blown revolution. So what governments are waking up to is the fact that around the world we're seeing not just a decline in birth rates in most countries, but a decline in marriages, a rise in divorces, a rise in number of single people. And this is particularly profound in Generation Z, which is the generation that's really had the benefits of global massification of higher education. They are deciding, women like yourself are deciding, well, if I do get married, it's got to be on my terms. I'm not going to go into an unequal relationship. I'm looking for a man who can be my equal, who's not going to be my boss. So if they can't find a man like that, if they can't find a man with what I call progressive masculinity, the women are going to say, well, why bother? And frankly, I think in countries like India, I have to say, unfortunately, I don't think you've got a lot of progressive men. I think most of the men in India will be traditional minded. They'll be patriarchal orientated, even if they don't realize it. And the women, there's now a massive gap. There's one writer calls it a generation divide, and it is. It's a massive generation divide with Generation Z between independent femininity, a progressive femininity, and a regressive traditional masculinity. Men and women are growing apart. That's basically where we are now.
Hmm. So we'll come to India in a bit. Let's start with Japan. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So researchers claim that there's this Japanese phenomenon called ohi tori sama, uh,
That's right.
which translates loosely as being single and not caring about anyone else, if I'm right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so if you can just break this down for us, because in Japan, this has gone to a different level altogether.
Oh, it tells you.
Yeah, and do you think this is coming as a response to the constant need for social acceptance? Um, is it like a response to the hyper-globalized world of social media? Why do you think this has come up? I mean,
Well, Japan is particularly interesting, and the question is whether what we're seeing in Japan today is going to emerge around the rest of the world. The signs are it might. I've got one of my children is a boy, a man in his 20s, is withdrawn, and he lives in the UK, and he's an expression of this desire to retreat from society. So what I see in Japan are um, three types of masculinity. One is traditional masculinity. And to identify traditional masculinity, let me say that back in the 40s and 50s, the 30s, 40s, 50s, you had a hyper-masculine military type of masculinity in Japan. And that which partly fueled the rise of Japanese empire and the conflict in the Second World War. Then after that, from the 60s onwards, you got a new type of masculinity, which was a salary man masculinity, which was where the men devoted themselves not to the army or the armed forces, but to companies like Toyota, Honda. Now, where we are now is a generation of men who've come about certainly since the end of the 70s, probably into the 80s and 90s, who are rejecting both of that. They don't want the traditional military type of masculinity, but they can't see a new future for themselves. So what you've got are two responses to that, which is affecting women. One response is the emergence of a very feminine type of male in Japan. They're called grass eaters or herbivore men. If you Google these figures, these terms, you'll see them. And there's been a lot of research by sociologists in Japan on this very feminine type of masculinity. And the other type of masculinity, the one that you refer to, the Horitsumiura, is a rejection. It's almost like a collapsed masculinity. And in my book on toxic masculinity, I describe it as collapsed masculinity because it's not really an expression of anything. It's a retreat into oneself. Bottom line is, two things have happened. One, you've got Japanese Generation Z and young millennials are not hooking up. They're not getting into relationships. They're staying celibate. They're certainly not getting married, and they're not having babies. This will lead to the collapse of the Japanese society, probably in the early part of the next century, if this isn't changed. And we're already seeing dramatic effects on it. Now, whether this is going to get mirrored in the rest of the world, I don't know. But certainly the rest of the world are going in that direction. Again, what we're seeing is with Japanese society, we're seeing women becoming more confident, becoming more assertive, becoming more independent, becoming more agentic, deciding their options and choosing their options in a pragmatic, rational way. But the men, where does that leave the men? They're in a state where they can't gravitate towards the old traditional model. The jobs have gone, the work cultures have gone. What are they replacing it with? Well, I say some men are going towards a more feminine expression, some are retreating from society altogether, and there will be some who hang on to traditional values. But I think the traditional values don't have a future because that's not where the world is going right now. So we're looking at some very stark, disturbing demographics. Um, and I think that if I was in the Japanese government, my priority would be how do I address this? Now, the Japanese government and Japanese organizations are trying to pay women to have children. It doesn't work. And it's not working in China either. The government's trying to incentivize women to have babies. And if a woman doesn't want to get married and have babies, there's no way money's going to make any difference. It's not going to work. There has to be other changes within society.
Okay. Um, Studies have estimated that by 2040, 50% of the population aged 15 or older are expected to live in single person households.
Mm.
Does this worry you? I mean, how do you look at this analysis like this?
Well, I've got 5 children and only one of them's married, and they're all over 25, and none of them have babies. I'm not a grandfather. I'm not a grandfather. And I think there's going to be many. I'm 75 years old with 5 children, and I'm not a grandfather. One of my sons has been married. He's now 50. He's been married for 25 years. He decided not to have children years ago. He stayed married. I've got 4 others who aren't married, they're in relationships, but they're not married, and I don't see any of them having children. So I'm living it out in my own life. I've had 5 children, 4 biological and 1 stepdaughter. I come from a family where 100 years ago, my ancestors had 8, 9, 10 children.
Yeah.
It's gone. It's disappeared. Now, how do I feel about it? What I'm concerned about is not the birth rates. What I'm concerned about is that women have empowerment. I'm concerned that women have agency. They have freedom from violence. They have freedom from abuse. They have freedom from patriarchal pressures. That's what drives my work. That is what's driven my work for 30 years. That's why I've looked at men and masculinities. If you want to look at the state of women's lives, you have to look at men's identity because men have been the major vehicle or force or influence on the potential for women to have agency, to have a full, free, non-violent, opportunistic life. So what's happened is that society's changed dramatically since the end of the Second World War, but men have not. Women have changed dramatically, but men have not. So men are trying to catch up now. And the conversation you and I are having, which hope people may well read it, they read my articles, they read my books. There's certainly a lot more noise around men than there ever was before. When I did my PhD into men and masculinities in the early 1990s, I was one of a handful of sociologists who studied men and masculinities. Now, you put out a Google notice for something, a term like toxic masculinity, which I helped co-create. And there's hundreds, thousands of terms. This term is being used all the time in the mainstream media, not just in academia. So I'm pleased that this is coming about. But I don't worry for men because I think men are changing. A lot of men, all men like me, with a liberal, progressive masculinity, and I think those men who can't change, then they're going to go the way of the dinosaur. They're going to become extinct because they have no purpose in society.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I listen to Teal Swan quite a bit. So, psychologist, and she's into self-improvement, self-healing, and all. So I remember her saying that, all of this is becoming so complicated, even for men to heal from, because, I mean, the traumas go so deep as to, how the way traditional men have behaved does not mean that every man is the same, but yet they have to deal with that. So it's even very complex for men also to get out of it, I think, because it's like as a species, as a gender species, they're going in a different direction. So, um, I mean, I think it's completely confused. Masculinity is confused in today's day and age.
Well,
right?
first of all, the thing to say is that there's more than one masculinity. There are multiple masculinities. And all that masculinity is a socially devised way of understanding or expressing or identifying the male species. So if you're born with a particular set of genitalia, then you're classified as male. And if you're born with the other set, you're classified as female. And that's a biological division.
Mm.
I have to say that there are more than two sexes, so let's just leave that aside for the moment. But let's stay with the two sexes. That biological division then manifests itself through society and has done through history as a social, cultural power divide. Now, the point is this, that if it's okay for men like myself who are progressive, um, don't want to be part of the patriarchal setup, but the irony is that all men benefit from patriarchy to some extent. It gives them advantages over work opportunities, over power over women, over able to express themselves. This has got to go. And that's why the point is that one of the things that a lot of feminists got wrong in the beginning is they felt that we just needed equality. A lot of liberal feminists like Betty Friedan, they said, we need liberal feminism will bring us equality.
Mm.
You can't have equality between men and women.
Mm.
And the reason is this, is because historically, men have had power over women.
Mm.
So for women to rise up, men have got to come down. Men have got to lose that power and authority over the female species. So they've got to lose the benefits of patriarchy. They've got to lose what Bob Connell, sociologist, called the patriarchal dividend. They've got to lose that.
Mm.
And that's the thing that they won't like. But that's what's coming. And I think if we can get to a state where there's equality, I don't think it'll ever be quite like that. I think it's going to be like that. And I see women rising. I see women asserting power. Women, they're going to get educated. They're going to be in positions of power. We're likely to see a first woman of the US presidency. And that's going to become more and more apparent as we go through through the rest of this century. So I see men losing power. I see women gaining power, and men have got to be okay with that. They've got to accept it, and they've not got to invest their identity in having power over women or indeed over gay people.
Mm. Mm. Also, this debate about today, I mean, right now it's about male and women, but I think essentially we are talking about the masculine and the feminine, right? Yeah.
Well, we're talking, as I say, these are socially devised constructions. So when you've identified a baby as female or male, you know as well as I do what happens next.
Yes.
The whole social world
Yeah.
gives a gravitational pull towards those two children. So they emerge by the time they get to kindergarten. The boy's already assimilated what it means to be male. The girl's already assimilated what it means to be female. Now, the point is this, where we want to get to is a situation where by the time the child is 5, the boy does not think he's superior to girls.
Mm.
And the girl does not think she's inferior to boys.
Mm.
My next book is called Toxic Femininity. And that's a problem for a lot of women because toxic femininity is based on the myth of women's subservience. And toxic femininity can generate a lot of psychological disturbances in a woman if she's living through her life and she's not able to express herself in a free, agentic, authentic way. So this is going to need changes in the schools and education system in government. But at the moment, it's going to take time. It's going to take another 100 years. You may well see it in your lifetime. And I think you're going to see some dramatic changes in your lifetime. I'm seeing them in my lifetime.
It's before 100 years. It's already bigger, going at a pace. Yeah.
This is the fastest revolution we've ever had. Forget the communist revolution. Forget religious revolutions. This gender revolution affects everybody, everywhere, and there's no escape from it. And you can't put women back in their patriarchal box. They're not going to go, and men are having to change. But we are going to get kickback. So expect there to be kickback. You're going to see more violence against women. You're going to see more hostility against women. You're going to see more misogynistic attitudes expressed on social media against women. But that's not going to be forever. That's going to be a kickback, I think, which will eventually go away because the next generation um, hopefully will change. But I have to say, on that point, just looking at America, we're in the middle of a US presidential election.
Mm.
If the women were not voting in America,
Mm.
if there were no women voting in America, Donald Trump would walk it
Mm.
because the men are voting for him, the women are not, by
Mm.
and large. So that is part of this gender diversion, global gender divergence that we're seeing.
Mm. Um, in Japan, according to a recent study, about 40,000 people have died alone in their homes.
Yeah, no.
In the
Mm,
This is according to a study which happened in the first half of this year. And
mm,
suicidal thoughts have been commonly reported amongst those living alone. So
yeah,
this is not a small number which can be ignored. 40.
no, it's not a small number. It's a lot of people for a country like Japan. How many people living lonely lives? I
Yeah.
mean, somebody dying alone, that means they've lived alone, they've had very little human contact.
And when I
Th-
was even researching this, I mean, there's so many videos online about the people from the government who come to check, and they find out after weeks that a person has died because there's no one to report that somebody is dead. So they walk in and they come and they clean the place, and that's how they figure out that. And now that's happening in a scale like this. So, I mean, for me, this is reflective more of a deteriorating mental health situation for the masses.
Sure,
So,
sure.
fundamentally rooted in isolation and lack of healthy human connect. So, do you sense like a mental health pandemic which is coming up? I mean,
I mean, it's not healthy for an old person to live alone. I wouldn't like to live alone. Fortunately, I'm living with my wife and a stepdaughter and one of my sons in Thailand. It's to be alone is not, when you get older, is not a good thing. It will generate depression, mental health issues,
it's not just
and and
for old
and,
people. It's
and
for
not just for old people, for
have
everybody.
died, of course, but so the entire country is basically living alone, and the old ones are dying alone. Never, for sure. But do you really think things are changing? We know, but like there is society which is evolving in a certain way and going ahead, and we are all dealing with the repercussions. But one side of it is things like these, so which is clearly pointing to a mental health situation going widespread.
I think something we've got to factor in here, and that is AI. And what we're going to see, AI will replace human beings in relationships. We're already seeing that with men who are buying sex toys, robots
Yeah.
for sexual or intimate relationships or for companionship. We'll see more of that with women. AI is going to replace the human link in a lot of lives.
Yeah.
And the thing about AI, you can pretty much trust it, which you can't trust humans. And I'll give you an example with Korea at the moment. Korea is going through some major gender changes.
Mm.
South Korea, we're seeing a deep decline in the trust level between women and men in Korea, partly driven by things like deep fake porn, which has become endemic in Korea, male violences, misogyny. So women in Korea are saying, well, I don't only want to get married. It's not only I don't want to get married. I don't want to be with any men. I don't want to have a relationship with a man. I'm better off with AI. And the
Mm.
men are going to end up with AI because they'll have no choice because women won't be into relationships with them. Now, I'm generalizing, but there'll be a bigger and bigger percentage of taking on AI for companionship reasons. What that's going to mean for societies in the future, I can only guess. But for sure, we're not going to go back to where we were in the 1950s or 100 years ago. It's not going to happen. So society's changing dramatically. But I'd say part of the problem is that men are not changing. Women are changing. Why is it unreasonable for a woman to want to be independent?
Yeah.
Why is it unreasonable for a woman to want to have her own career, want to go to university?
Yeah.
Why is it unreasonable for a woman to decide whether or not she has children and how many children she has? Um, it's not. It's entirely reasonable. Men have been making these decisions for themselves for centuries. Now it's women's turn, and women aren't going to give up on this power, on this agency, on this opportunity for choice. Uh, and I think many women, in many cases, a lot of women would be better off living solo lives than they will be living with a man, because most of the violence that takes place against women takes place in the home.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think you just summed it up in one line. Women are changing, but men are not changing. So all of this boils down to that. I mean, all the changes in AI going and people using AI as a, as an alternative to human. This is all, I feel, masculinity trying to cope in
That's
whatever
good.
way they can, but not being
That's
able to do it. Yeah.
that's a good line. I shall use that. Masculinity trying to cope. Yeah, exactly. And that's so when a man buys a sex robot,
Mm,
he doesn't have to make an effort.
yeah.
He doesn't have to learn how to be with a woman. He doesn't have to learn how to communicate.
Yeah.
He can live wrapped up in his own vacuum, his own masculine vacuum, without any interference. He can replace the robot. He can give it a new wig. He can buy any number of robots. He doesn't have to try to be different, to be a more progressive man. He can fester in his own traditional masculinity, but he's going to fester alone and he isn't going to be healthy.
Yeah.
But that's the sad thing. But until men do change, that's the state that we're going to be in. I think men are changing. There's a progressive masculinity around the world, but it's still in the minority. It's not the majority of men. I know progressive masculine men in India, and there are a lot of them doing excellent work in this area of gender analysis and men and masculinities, but they're not. They are the minority. Most men in India, as in the rest of the world, don't have the emotional intelligence. They don't have the courage. They don't have the empathy. They don't have the desire to understand themselves. If they can't, the thing is about a man. I'll give you an example.
Mm,
When I did my PhD many years ago, one of the questions I asked of the men managers was, "How can you explain to me how being a man has affected your life as a manager?
mm,
Can you explain to me how being a man has affected your life as a manager?" Out of 20 men, only one could even try to answer that question. They had no idea. You ask that question of a woman, you get instant responses,
yeah. She's
massive
facing it
responses.
all, yeah, she's facing it every now and then. Yeah.
You know, they switch them on and it never stops. Men, unless men become self aware,
Yeah.
they can't understand women. They don't understand themselves. So, how are they going to understand women?
Yeah. Very well put. Yeah. Completely agree. Yeah.
It's sad, but I say I've been studying it now for 30 years. I predicted the backlash. I knew we were going to get a backlash against women, but and we're going to get even worse backlash yet. You see what the Taliban are doing in Afghanistan. There'll be other countries trying to do the same, I suspect. Saudi Arabia's in that area, parts of the Middle East. I don't know about India. I think India's got a very vocal female population now, but Pakistan possibly. So in Russia, I don't know. But you can't silence women and you can't force them to have babies. You can try, but it's not, that's not a world that we want to be looking towards. So my hope is that men change, and I think we've got to put pressure on men to change.
Mm, yeah. Um, so how do you think the governments are going to cope with this? I mean, people stop procreating. Is this species going to go ahead, or is it coming to an end? Where are we headed, really? I mean,
Where is what?
where are we headed in the sense that is this even going? And also because this is something which has been observed across countries now, all over the world, which is showing you these trends. So it's not one particular government or one particular
Mm.
country trying to deal with it. So there must be some reasons which is like, which is leading to the universality of a situation like this.
Yeah, you're right.
And how
Uh,
the governments are going to deal with what do you think is coming up in the future? How?
well, when we look at governments, we're looking at men in power by and large. And unless those men are self-aware, liberal-minded, progressive, then they're not in the position to make any changes. It needs women in power. So that's the process. You need to stop electing men into power in India. And that's going to take time. I mean, it's happening in.
Also, in a country like India, this concept of internalized misogyny is very, very common, where you have equally misogynist women. I mean, I don't want to take names, but we all know the, crime rate in India, in cities and in states, which is led by females. So it's not really, that's what I'm saying. It's less of a male woman thing, man woman thing. Yes, I mean, broadly sociologically, yes, but once you get deeper into it and you think about masculinity and femininity, and that's when you realize that this has got less to do with a man or a woman, because you have women who are completely a product of this patriarchal system, so they think
Well,
that way. So
that is toxic femininity, and
mm,
and my book that comes out next year, which I've just finished writing, looks at the way toxic femininity manifests itself in women's lives. And when women are aggressive towards other women, that is coming from this patriarchal context. So it's not coming from a women's power base. It's coming from a set of women who are trying to co-opt themselves into male ways of being. So it does the women no favor. To give you an example, female genital mutilation. Why would any woman force another woman or female to undergo female genital mutilation? That is collaborating, being complicit in women's subservience, in women's oppression. Now, women are subservient many women are compliant and complicit in it, but that is an expression of toxic femininity. It's not helping these women. Part of the point is that the women need to move away from that way of being and embrace independent femininity, which is a way of being in the world which is far more inclusive, considerate, empathetic, uh, less violent.
so I
Um,
think step
but
one is to just educate yourself about and get more clarity as to what is femininity, masculinity, toxic.
sure.
It's all because it's all messed up in the heads of people. So
Well,
till they have
yeah,
the education.
you've got we've got to educate girls to be assertive and independent and speak for themselves and not copy men. We've got to train girls and educate girls not to be complicit in their own sexual objectification. And we've got to educate girls not to rely on men to make their lives perfect. And we've got to educate males to be empathetic, to be safe, to be non-violent, to be aware of and respectful towards females and respectful towards themselves. This, whether men can do it, comes back to an original question you made: is what is the future? It depends whether men can change, because women already have. So it depends whether we're going to see men change, and if so, in what way. We know men can kick back against it, against women's empowerment, but we also know many men are for it, and they're part of that process. And I'm one, and there's many millions of men like me. I'm not the only one. But in the long-term future, it's not getting focused too much on the women who are a problem, but we need to identify toxic femininity. That's for sure. That's why I've written this new book. And it's just let me I haven't got it here. But toxic femininity is something that will become more prominent. Now, toxic femininity is not the same as toxic masculinity.
Mm.
Toxic femininity is a byproduct of toxic masculinity. If you didn't have toxic femininity, you wouldn't have toxic masculinity. You wouldn't have toxic femininity. One feeds off the other. Toxic femininity is when a woman believes she's worthless because a man tells her so. It's when a woman gets into a relationship that's oppressive, abusive, diminishing, and she thinks it's her fault. It's when a woman blames herself for the problems that men have given her in her life. That's toxic femininity. And it's when a woman, frustrated at all the circumstances of her life, takes it out on other women. That's why you have a problem with many mother-in-laws in India and other countries, traditional countries. The in-law women, they take it out on the next generation because it was taken out on them. And that's how it's gone back, generation after generation after generation. Now, one of the things I want to do in my new book is alert women to what they're doing. And it's based on 12 case studies of women who've gone through this, and some of them have come out of it. The answer in the book is self-love. That's the only way you're going to overcome that. Self-love, both for women and for men. Most men do not like themselves. They're trying to copy male models of behavior, whatever they've got in their head, and they don't meet up to it. They don't reach that model of achievement, and they hate themselves for it. Most men feel insecure, nervous, inadequate, shy. They realize that they're not what they pretend to be. And that is the failure of this sort of masculinity.
Yeah.
Women's problem is that they don't love themselves. They'll look for a man to love them. And what I say in the book is a woman with toxic femininity will say to herself, where is the man that's going to love me?
Mm.
A woman with independent femininity will say, I love me.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Basically, it boils down to self-love and
Absolutely.
turning
If
into.
that's the one thing, you see, you and I can't change the world.
Mm.
I can have an impact in my writing. You can have an impact in your writing and research. But the biggest impact you're ever going to have in the world is changing yourself. And if you change yourself towards one of calmness, empathy, self-love for yourself, all aspects of yourself, what I call totally inclusive self-love, then that is the beginning of the changes that we're going to need to see in the world.
And very interestingly, that's also tapping into the inner feminine within you, which means,
That's right.
the more inclusive side of you rather than conquering and, trying to get over,
That's right.
feeding
That's
off.
right. So not competition, not aggression, not kicking outwards. Yeah, you want to achieve and you want to be part of an achieving world, but you've got to protect yourself and you've got to look at yourself. You don't protect yourself by
Yes.
building bodyguards behind you and being aggressive and fighting. You can only do that through self-love. It's the only way.
Yeah. Again, in India, we see percentage of single women and men in urban India is higher than in the rural spaces, with
Yeah.
women exceeding men in number. So within the cultural landscape of a diverse and dynamically evolving country like India, what do you think? Is this just for the privileged women who are, now who have the liberty to live in their own way? Because just taking my example, I'm 30, but I don't think of marriage. It's not even on the list right now because
Sure.
I am substantially privileged to be thinking in that way. But
Yeah.
if we talk about the rural India, of course, numbers are not as high as in urban, yet they are changing. And I mean, similar trends are being observed, but not as much as the one in urban. So I'm only interested to see the way things are shifting now, maybe a few years from now. How would this sociologically impact a country like India, where even in the rural spaces, where all of this is basically identifying fluid gender roles is taboo in a country like India, and which is fine with like the urban section is still accepting of it, and that's why we see the changes. But it will be a huge shift if if these things percolate to the rural sections as well. And I'm only interested to see what kind of change will it bring to a country like India on the whole. I mean, social.
Well, let's say you're 30 years old. In 20 years' time, you could be the Prime Minister of India if you chose to be so.
Mm.
But there is a woman sat somewhere in India today who's gone one day going to lead India. And I hope that woman, whoever she is, wherever she is a feminist or is at least concerned to have gender parity and
Mm.
is aware of the problems of patriarchy, male violence, and all the toxic stuff that comes with that sort of attitude with men. Now, if I was that woman, the first thing I would do, as far as the rural population is concerned, is to improve the education system in the rural schools. Because if you want to change women, you've got to change the education system. You can start with the schools, you can start in kindergarten, primary, through to secondary. There's no reason on earth why families in rural areas could not get a better, an advanced education. And you can bring changes about by teaching about empowerment and equality and choice and opportunity and respect in schools. Doesn't matter where the school is. It can be in the middle of a rice field. We've got them in Thailand, or it can be in the city. You've got them in Bangkok. Women like you, some woman like you can bring that about, and probably a woman will bring it about. It'll
Yes.
only come through education, through self-awareness, and through an innate desire within the woman to have a better life. But an individual can learn to love themselves without having money in the pocket, without having a high-powered job, without having a fancy car, without having 10 or 20 bank accounts. Some of the wealthiest people on earth do not love themselves. Elon Musk is an example. Donald Trump's another one. You can be poor and you can be without resources. But if you love yourself, that is a way forward for empowering yourself. So if you educate the children, the girls especially, but also the boys in rural India to love themselves, care for themselves, self-awareness, self-respect, and inclusivity, you'll bring about change. Absolutely.
Really see that happening because I mean the way rural India is today. See, in India, self-love is still a luxury for people, most people. So those
Sure.
who are kind of sorted with their survivals can then think about something beyond that. And even as a yoga teacher here, that's what I observe in people. I mean, those who are kind of sorted with their lives can then sit down and think about meditating. But how can we go and tell this to somebody who is struggling with just, to make ends meet and to get
So
things? So,
suffering is okay. The point about suffering is not bad. We're all going to suffer in life. I don't know you, and you don't have to tell me anything, but I know you've gone through sufferings. Everybody does. We all do. We learn from it. It's part of the process of self awareness, learning self management, learning to be like other human beings. Suffering is not to be avoided. You're not going to avoid it. The women that I've interviewed for my book, not all of them were rich. Some of them went through great pain, real poverty, and still are doing. But they can find a way through. In the end, they've got to call on their own reserves. You can't, money in the bank's not going to solve it. You're going to have to work, you're going to have to do your jobs, you're going to have to bring children up. But no matter what the problem is, whether you're single or married, you have to love yourself.
yes.
And it's not going to stop if you get money in your pocket.
But the thing is that, sir, the whole structure, the way society is structured around earning money itself, I mean, today it's
Mm.
changing. And in the urban sections, of course, it's different. A woman
Yeah,
can make a lot of money through her creative potentials, and she can actually capitalize on that and does not need to go through the conventional 9 to 5 job, which is making her do a certain thing and blocking all other, all the multidimensionality within her is blocked. That's not true for the privileged class. But when we look at
sure.
the lower sections of society, because their life is very masculine, the way they have to live their life, the structures around it, that's how we've built society. So even if they want to, and especially in the lower classes, you see the cases of abuse and all kinds of rapes and crimes is much higher.
Sure.
So
Um,
it's definitely a positive shift. I mean, in the near future, if it goes to that section, that's like the ideal thing, and I'll be happiest because it can also control the population of India. That's one thing, how it can work out. But yes, then we're looking at a complete shift in even, every kind of shift. It's not just about starts with gender, but the far-reaching implications are so much. I mean, from economics till to the social reality, social political reality, everything will change around this. So,
Everything will change, and I can't tell you exactly how it's going to change. I know what the trajectories have been for the last 70 years, but I can't, in all honesty, tell you what they're going to be for the next 70 years. I know where we are now, and where we are now is a rise in female sense of independence and new independent femininity, but also a pushback against this by those men who feel threatened by it. As I say, for me, education has to be the key intervention point. If you don't change the education system to encourage more independent thinking in children, to encourage more respect, empathy, emotional intelligence development in children, more critical thinking in children, then you're not going to get the social changes that you need.
and
It's
also, I think then the entire education system needs a revolution. I mean, the way it is in India is today actually just like a, I mean, India was not the same all along. Today it's the way because it's just after the British, once they left us, our education system has been designed in a certain way, which is not really how it used to be years and years back. So we were very very rich in the traditional arts and the way all our education was imparted. There was a concept of gurukulams where education was not limited to classrooms, but it used to happen in nature, and very, very, very free flowing and intuitive. So that is kind of, it's also, it's like a hangover from the West is what India is also suffering. That's another angle to that.
I have to say that's not going to go away. Let me tell you, I don't know if you heard of Harrow International Schools.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Well, Harrow International Schools first started in Bangkok. That was the first one. Then they opened up in Hong Kong, in China, South Korea. Harrow International Schools, it's actually a separate company, but it's the same brand from Harrow Private School in London. Harrow International Schools are now opening in India. And there's a whole generation, a new generation of international schools opening in India, and they will cater for the moneyed elite in India. And out of these international schools in India will be the next generation of leaders, male and female. Now, I have to tell you, if they're international schools following the Cambridge curriculum or the International Baccalaureate, they will be forced, required, not least by agencies like the Council of International Schools, to follow totally inclusive criteria. One of my co-authors on the book Becoming an International School, Angelina Howe, is uh, a person who works for the CIS, going to international schools and encouraging total inclusivity. So let me say that there's a whole new elite of
Mm.
international schools emerging now as we speak in India that are going to cater for the next generation of well off, highly educated, moneyed, inclusive minded men and women. And that's unavoidable. That's happening around the world, but we're now seeing it kick off big time in India. So I think what we hope is that these young men and women now going through these schools, when they come into positions of power and authority, and they surely will, they follow a totally inclusive mindset because they've been taught it in the schools today. That's the one hope. And I don't know if it'll happen, but it's certainly not going to happen unless we try. That's one reason why I wrote these books, Total Inclusivity. It's an intervention, and education is the most important one. We need to get the children through these schools, and we need to get them to university, and we need to get them to be thinking and recognizing the inclusive character of themselves and of the society that we live and work in. You're not going to do away with poverty in India. That's not going to happen in any number of lifetimes. But you can, through education, empower women, empower females to think more agentically and to be more self-aware and self-assertive.
Um, Now, another global trend is aligning with the rise in singletons, which is that of celibacy. Now, this is where it gets more interesting. The rise of BCs or voluntary celibates has been evident in Japan and South Korea for over a decade now, but now we're seeing
Yeah.
it worldwide. Um, Dr. Justin Lehmiller of Sex and Psychology podcast says that there is a long term trend among people today in general for having less sex with few partners. Humans are less sexually active with some foregoing sex altogether. So, how do you correlate this rise in celibacy with collapsing of marriage as a social institution? I mean, as an expert in
Well,
this field, you would consider the role of evolving gender identities. Do you consider the role of evolving gender identities as a threat to the propagation of the species? How do you look at it, or do you celebrate the change?
I wouldn't personally be too bothered if the world population went down a lot. Um,
It's
I
not
think we've
went
got.
down,
I think.
it's instead.
I think with 8 billion going up to maybe 9.5 billion before the end of the century, that's more than we can handle. The population, the environment's already under stress. So I think having fewer humans can't be a bad thing. So I'm not concerned about that. I am concerned. Um, I think we've got. I didn't explore it in my. I've not explored this in great depth. Though I've written about relationships and sexuality in the past. We're seeing a decline in sexual relations. We're seeing a rise in celibacy, and we're also seeing a rise in something which I didn't talk about, and that's a rise in bisexuality. We're seeing many more women engage in bisexual relationships, or at least educated women, middle class women are more open. They've got a more fluid orientation towards same sex relationships, which men don't have. So, for example, recent research in the USA suggests that women are almost 3 times more likely than men to identify as bisexual or orientated towards same-sex intimacy. So there's a there's a decrease in the number of women who are only attracted to men. So sexuality is a funny thing. I believe that sexuality is largely biological. We are born straight, bi, whatever, but there's also a certain element of fluidity. And what we're seeing is that independent femininity accompanies a more fluid interpretation and an expression of sexuality, which it doesn't with men. Most men who have toxic masculinity, the worst thing you can call that man is gay or queer. Uh, you know, and it's that would undermine his sense of self very quickly. With women, it doesn't. So there's a number of things here. There's a celibacy. There's a rise in bisexuality with women. There's a division in political orientations between men and women, certainly with Generation X. Decline in marriage, rise in divorce, decline in birth rates. They're all pointing in one direction, which is women striving forward with a more progressive expression of self, which includes a more expressive and fluid interpretation of their sexual relationships. But men who are still, I think a lot of men are just absorbed now watching porn. They'd rather watch porn and have a sex robot than they would get into a relationship with a real woman. I think that's probably the direction we're going in. That's not all men, for sure, but it's a lot. And I think that's not going to help the species. It's not going to help men learn.
Yeah,
But I
so,
think, go
but
on, sorry.
but this says that this is pointing to a rise in celibacy. So that's what I wanted to get clear on. Is it celibacy that people are embracing, or is it just different, you know, variations to the same sexual, release in a different way, not in conventional heteronormative relationships, but
Yeah,
in a
yeah.
different way? is it like, are people really having sex, or have they stopped having sex? Because if that is where it's going, which is what I understand, because um, celibacy is something which we can relate with somebody who really really turns inward, and they're working on their energies to a point that now they want to take themselves to the next level of evolution, and that is why they willingly opt out of sexual relations of any kind. So that's what I wanted more clarity on. Is it going in that direction, or is it just that people are having their own ways of pleasuring themselves, which is not within the foundations of a heteronormative relationship?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you're obsessively into masturbation, then are you still celibate? Probably not. You're still turned on. You're still getting sexual excitement from some sort of image, and you're expressing that in your own private way. Um, I think that's happening. I think pornography is serving that need or that opportunity. But what we're also seeing is this separation of the sexes. So it's a separation that's political, it's emotional, it's physical, it's educational. We've got a gap opened up between educated women and non-educated or poorly educated men. If but the problem is that sex is not easy to manage.
Mm.
Sexual desire is a biological impulse.
Mm.
It's not easy to turn it off. And I I've gone through all sorts of changes in my own lifestyle. In the last five years, I've been celibate, and it's been the best thing that's ever happened to me. I don't want to get back into a relationship, a sexual relationship, but for most of my life, from the age of 16, that's not how I was. And I think it's very difficult to manage that in a way which is healthy, productive, equal. Men struggle with it, women struggle with it. I've been married a number of times, so clearly I've struggled with it. But I think that the celibacy that we're seeing in relationships now or in women in people's lives now is more to do with, I think, I'm guessing, I can't know for sure, because I think we need to do research on this, more research on this. I think it's women just backing off from relationships. I don't think it's men who want to be celibate. I think it's women saying, I'm not going to get involved with the men. And if I do, it's going to be on certain terms. And I think that would explain why there's a rise in women going for bisexual relationships. So I think if you push me into a corner to answer this, I'd have to say it's women retreating from men.
Yeah.
It's
Basically,
women's
I still,
rejecting men.
yeah, I still see a lot of sex happening, just not
Yeah,
between women and in the way, just for reproduction and for the next generation.
sure. It's for sexual pleasure, sexual satisfaction, sexual outlet. It's serial monogamy. These are not necessarily long-term relationships. They're not going to lead to lifelong commitment or marriage, and they're certainly not going to lead to children. People can't switch off the sexuality, and it's not healthy to do it. You have to wait till you're my age, and then hopefully it'll switch off automatically. But while you're going through it, you've got to live it out.
Mm.
But women have choices. If women are able to express themselves in a multitude of ways, they can have solo sex, they can have sex with same-sex partners, they can have sex with men. But it's not what it's saying. All that is saying is that women are not forced to get married in order to have sex,
Yeah.
which was where it was in the past.
Yeah.
Women don't need now to get married to have sex. If women want some sort of sexually satisfying relationship, they can find that in their own ways. They don't have to get married in order to have that. In fact, they're probably best not getting married in order to have that. But that's getting played out. We're certainly seeing a rise in celibacy. Again, it's one of these things that's kicked in East Asia, Japan, and South Korea, but it's now spreading. So I guess you'll see it in your society. Though I don't know, I've not seen any research on it, but I wouldn't be surprised. It's a consequence of a transformation in gender relationships, the emergence of a new gender independent femininity,
Mm.
and women deciding for themselves just what they want and how they're going to get it.
Yeah. Yeah. And this also takes me to something deeper and something probably beyond sociological constructs of males and females, the way we've defined it, is in the Indian context. We see that Indian males and females are now trying to redefine their lives in a new way, discovering singleness not as a rebellion to tradition or by avoiding taking responsibilities, but finding a new meaning and taste in life where it is more a value change in holistic human terms. So, when we are talking about something which is not coming as a result of a rebellion, but people finding a new meaning and taste in their lives, we want to go deeper into what this new meaning and taste is really all about. And how I see this is this can be a result of the slow changing accepting of the gender identities for sure. That's one aspect of it. But there has also been a rise in the spiritual identity of a nation, especially
Mm,
when we consider
mm,
India
mm,
and the way it's going and mushrooming now all across the world. But that's how it emerged in India and all the Eastern traditions as well, the Buddhist traditions and other forms of uh, meditation and yoga and holistic changes in lifestyle, which is coming. This is now proactively penetrating the day to day lifestyle of citizens. So basically, as somebody who is myself actively involved in this, the foundations of where our work begins is to basically help turn people inward rather than trying
mm.
to look for anything outside. So once you start with that journey, it's all about tapping into uh, the infinite potential within your body, recognizing the masculinity and femininity within yourself, having more awareness about that within you, so that because till the time a person is self-aware, no amount of education is going to do anything. And language and education, the way we know it, goes only to a certain limit because that is also catering to our logical mind. But what we are essentially trying to do by inculcating meditation and yoga in people's lives is to make them tap into more intuitive dimensions, which is, naturally the more feminine side of them. So, do you see this as a solution? Because, in my opinion,
Oh, absolutely.
when we talk about celibacy, celibacy makes sense to me in that case where you're not really forced into becoming, you're not forcibly kind of held, you're not holding yourself back from a certain expression of your sexuality, but willingly you walk into a place where you're more in control of your own energies. And yeah, and you just don't want to indulge on a certain level but take yourself to the next level, which clearly points to humanity on the whole going to a next level. And maybe we are looking at human evolution because sociologically, definitely we are going to the next level. All the surveys and everything is pointing to that. It can be because of the changing gender roles and all of that. For sure there is an embracing of femininity, but how do you really tap into that femininity within you? You cannot hammer it down anybody by giving a lecture or speech somewhere. People are going to do what they feel like doing. So personally I see this as I mean, the only solution to this is to turn inward and embrace these concepts. So uh, I mean, that's what I had to say about celibacy being related with this, how it relates to the surveys, the way it is showing up. So do you
The
think?
only one solution, and that's totally inclusive self love.
Yeah.
That is self love, where you recognize all aspects of your intersectional identity,
Yeah.
your strengths, weaknesses, all the components, and you look inwards. You become self aware, self responsible, self loving, self managing. There's different stages in it. And totally inclusive self love. This is what you're talking about. I've got two books out next year, both relate to this. One is a semi autobiography, and I talk about my own spiritual journey. I'm a Buddhist. I've been a Buddhist for 20 years since I lived in Thailand. I meditate every day. The totally inclusive self love is a spiritual process. I don't follow religion so much. I'm not a great follower or fan of any religions, but I am very, very spiritual. And
Mm.
I find that this looking inward is the best way to live with the outside world.
Mm.
And if you love yourself, you will not abuse yourself. You
Mm.
will stay off drugs, you'll stay off alcohol, you'll stay off all the toxic stuff that will affect you mentally, physically. But you won't be selfish. It's a form of being selfish, but it's a healthy selfishness. It's a self-protection. It's not an ego trip. It's not about doing other people down. It's about being aware of yourself and loving yourself in a holistic way. And what you're saying
Mm.
is it's what's it. One way to describe it is the new humanism. It's recognizing that I am because we are.
Mm. Yeah.
I am here because you're here, and you're here because I'm here, and I'm affecting you, you're affecting me. We're all affecting each other. This
Mm.
is why we've got to look inward, not outward. We can't rely on governments to do it because the governments are flawed as well. They're made up of men and women who themselves are struggling, incomplete, toxic. You look to yourself. If we get eight, detoxify yourself, and you'll detoxify the world. And spirituality, not religion, but spirituality, that intuitive sense of being at one with something bigger and greater than yourself, is the way forward. I write about it in this book I've got coming out, which is it's called Love Yourself, Design Yourself. And you can design yourself, but you can only do it from a process of self-love. And I think that you're right. I think there is what you're offering, what you're outlining here is a very optimistic uh, appraisal. And I think I'd like to think you're right. And I sense it too. I think, yeah, I agree with you. But the way I see it is it's not going to come from reading the Quran or reading the Bible or following Ganesh or any particular religious idol or icon absolutely strictly. It's about being self-aware and intuitive within yourself and loving every aspect of yourself. If you love every aspect of yourself, that love will go outwards.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
That's as far as I've got with it. You know, I'm 75 years old. I need to stay here for another 75 years. And maybe then I'll know a bit more. But that's as far as I've got after 75 years. And I don't know how much more I've got. So far I'm okay, my brain's okay. I'm still writing. Um I don't know any more than that really. It's I don't know if I want to come back here. I know when I die, I'm not going to go. When I die and when you die, you're not going to go to Hinduism or Zionism or Muslim or Christianity. You're going to go to the spiritual world. And whatever the spiritual world is, if your soul is going to stay aware, then that's where your soul's going to go. And that's where my soul's going to go. And I don't know if I want to come back to this earth. Maybe I'll go to another earth. I don't know. Or maybe I've had enough. But I've had 75 years and I can't say I know any more than that. Um,
Yeah.
it's it's
Actually,
taken me this long.
when you look at self-love, right, some people have very distorted beliefs of what self-love really is.
So,
What self-love really is. So, for a lot of people, it becomes more like a let me not do anything and just, justify myself for something which I may have done wrong because I love myself.
mhm,
So it's self-love is also very, very misunderstood in today's world.
it
Uh,
is.
yeah,
So,
and I mean,
and I explain that in my new book. I say what self-love is not, um, as well as what I call. That's why I have the definition of totally inclusive self-love, and it's well detailed in my next two books that are coming out. Um, I can only write, I can only explain this to people, whether they get it, they understand it, whether they bother with it, whether they read it, whether it makes any impact on their lives. I don't know, but I can't not write. I'm having to do this because I've had a good life. I've been lucky. I've not no complaints about my life. So I think I put something back, and the best concept I've come up with is totally inclusive. then total inclusivity and self-love. I think they're all wrapped up, obviously, in gender identities.
Yeah.
But
It's
um,
a lot of
I'm up.
new agey, spiritually enlightened,
Yeah,
new
yeah,
agey stuff
sure.
are going around saying a lot of things about self-love, which does not really make sense because even to love yourself, you need to work on yourself, right? And the process
Oh
of
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
a
It's
very
not.
pleasant
It's
process.
not. It's not about retreating into yourself and saying "fuck you" to the rest of the world. That is not self-love. It's recognizing who you are and why you are, and going through the suffering and not blaming yourself or anybody else for it, but going through it and learning from it, recognizing your strengths and your weaknesses, learning to manage yourself, finding a calmer mind. I do think that meditation is important.
Mm,
I think you've got to lay off alcohol. I think you've got to lay off drugs. You've you've I meditate and I find that helps me have a calmer mind.
mm,
Um, I've been meditating for 20 years, and I don't think I would have learned what I have over the last 20 years if I hadn't learned to meditate. And I learned to meditate through Buddhism. But I also follow Hindu gods. I've got Ganesh here, small ivory Ganesh here, and
mm, mm,
it's about connecting with something beyond me. Um, I can go and find it I've been into temples, into mosques, and found the spirituality in a mosque. I found it in cathedrals and churches in England. It can be anywhere where people are doing good and thinking good things.
mm. So
The energy, it's the energy.
yeah, I'm a yoga teacher with Isha Foundation, which you must have heard of.
Yeah.
Basically, we look at yoga as a tool for our internal well-being, and yoga as a technology, not as something which is coming out of a certain religion, or not looking at it from that point. Because that is how it was. Even in Hinduism, yoga, when it was propagated or when it originated, it was less of something which came just out of a religious, and there was a very, very deep scientific understanding as to, and it is very subjective if you get into it. There are so many aspects. I mean, we look at the body and the self as the cosmos. So, there's a whole world within yourself. So I
Mm.
think that has been working very well for me and for other people that I've come across. And I can relate with the trends with the celibacy, rise in celibacy, and all of that. But I am not sure how this pans out for those who are not self aware and those who have not taken that step towards their own internal well being. So, yeah.
Over the next 50 years, one thing is for sure, the earth and the people on it are going to come up to some crucial decisions, some crucial moments. Um, we can't go forward in a self-aware, knowing manner if one half the population is trying to control the other half.
Mm,
So we've got. I'm optimistic in some way. I think all the spiritual shifts that you're identifying and referring to, we're seeing around the world, is partly to do with, as you'd be aware, it's partly to do with people wanting a different set of answers. They've got different questions, but they've particularly got questions about themselves. I think it's you can't find peace within yourself unless you've got a quiet mind, unless you're calm, unless you're without hatred, without anger, unless you have forgiveness for yourself and others, and unless you have understanding. That is easy to say, but it's not easy to achieve. But it can be done. And the spiritual shifts that you're referring to, they may lead a lot of people, they are leading a lot of people towards a greater self understanding. I don't think people are getting heavier into formalized religions, they're finding it more within themselves. And I think that's where the concept of self love works. But I say you've got to understand the concept. It's not selfish. It's not egotistical. It's not aggressive. It's not competitive. It's about forgiveness, self awareness, self understanding. Uh,
the opposite.
the first person, if you're going to communicate in the world, the first person you're going to communicate with is yourself. And the other thing is to separate identity from self. See, what do I know about you? You're Indian, you're female, Generation Z or young millennial. you're a yoga teacher, you've been to university, you're middle class. So I know those things about you. You're a daughter, you may be a sibling, you may be whatever sexuality you are is your business. But these are all parts of your intersectionality. Because, like me, they constitute who you are. But then there's something else separate, because that's just your identity. There's also something else. There's yourself, and yourself isn't necessarily wrapped up in all that identity.
Mm.
Because when I look at you, the first thing I see is a woman. Next thing I see is an Asian woman. And after that, I'm not sure. I've got to find out more about you. But I don't see the self. The self is something that's hidden. You know it. You're living with it. That's what you've got to love.
Yeah. Very.
So a lot of men project outwards in their identity. They wear the nice suits, the big cars, the gold rings, the ego thing, the trophy wives, the girlfriends, the money in the bank, the helicopters, but they don't love themselves. They're not in touch with themselves. It's projecting outwards, it's not inwards. You are into understanding your inner self. That's what you want to do. That's why you're asking me these questions. And that's why you're going to develop. You're going to be far, far ahead of me by the time you get to 75. And you could be a very powerful, influential person. And you've probably got the opportunity, you will have the opportunity to do a lot of good. So over the next 40 years, you just imagine for a moment what you can achieve and what good you can do, not just for India, for your community, but for the world. You can do a lot of good things, and you've already started on that path. I was not where you are now when I was your age. I was struggling. I knew very, very little.
Mm.
My journey really only started about 25 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's gone through their share of ups and downs. So have I. But I was very grateful to land at the right place at the right time. And I would give complete credit to my guru, Sadhguru, who's, he's the founder of Isha Foundation. And that's how, I mean, we've imbibed everything from him. So he is a pioneer in this field. If you research more about him, he's all in all about internal well-being and addressing the masculinity and femininity within us. So, at the
Okay,
end of the
that's
day,
good.
that's that.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Send me. Can you send me a link?
yeah, sure, sure. For sure, for sure. Yeah. Uh, Dr. Whitehead, it was very nice having this conversation with you. I'm so grateful I got the opportunity, and it's been extremely insightful, informative, and I mean, it was very nice to just talk my heart out. Thank you so much for this interview. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the question. It's been delightful to talk to you, and I wish you every success in the future.
Thank
And please keep in touch. Any time at all, we touch base.
Yes, sure.
Take
Thank you.
care.
Thank you so much. Thank you.